Welcome, weary traveller, to a journey back in time, where the whispers of medieval knights reveal their intimate secrets. Forget what you think you know, and let the truth about desire, discretion, and duty in a world long past lull you into a peaceful slumber. This is not just history, it's history whispered into dreams. Before we begin, please consider subscribing and leave a like and a gentle comment. It helps these peaceful tales reach others who need rest. Now let's begin. As the embers of your day begin to fade, allow the gentle hum of historical inquiry to guide you into a deeper understanding of an era often misunderstood. Tonight we shall peel back the layers of myth and misconception, venturing into the private lives of people who lived centuries ago, exploring their desires, their constraints, and the fascinating tapestry of their intimate realities. Dim the lights, find your most comfortable repose, and let us embark on this calm, factual exploration together. The popular imagination often conjures images of medieval intimacy unfolding amidst silk sheets in candlelit chambers, perhaps with a lute playing softly in the background. The reality, for the vast majority of people living in the Middle Ages, was starkly different. Personal privacy, as understood in modern times, was a concept largely unknown, a luxury that simply did not exist for most. Life was lived in constant, close proximity, a shared existence that profoundly shaped every aspect of human interaction, including the most intimate. For the common peasant, home was typically a small, single-room dwelling. Within these humble abodes, an entire family would reside: parents, children, aging relatives, and often the family's livestock, a goat or two, perhaps a chicken with strong opinions about personal space. The distinction between kitchen, bedroom, and stable was often blurred, with these spaces technically occupying the same square footage, differentiated primarily by their distinct aromas. The very architecture of these homes, lacking corridors or specialized rooms, meant that one moved directly from one multifunctional space to another, with natural light dictating the open layout. Beds, when they existed as more than glorified piles of straw or leaves on the floor, were often shared by multiple family members or even guests. Curtains, which might offer a semblance of separation, were a luxury, primarily used for warmth or to delineate the master's bed from the communal sleeping area. This pervasive communal living meant that physical seclusion was a rare commodity. The cultural meaning of privacy, therefore, shifted from physical isolation to something more internal or situational, where the focus was on controlling the visibility and knowledge of certain actions rather than achieving true physical separation. This constant cohabitation fostered an environment of intense community observation, where gossip and public opinion served as powerful mechanisms of social control. The thin walls and close-knit communities ensured that news, or even suspicion, travelled faster than plague rats, meaning any deviation from social norms, particularly concerning intimate matters, would quickly become public knowledge. The consequences of such exposure, ranging from a ruined reputation to a strongly worded sermon delivered with maximum eye contact, underscore how social visibility directly enforced behavioural conformity. Even among the upper echelons of medieval society, true private rooms were not the norm until later in the period. In the early medieval castles, noble families often slept at the upper end of the great hall, sometimes separated from the rest of the household by nothing more than a curtain. As the centuries progressed, wealthier nobles began to acquire solar chambers or private apartments. These rooms, thought to derive their name from solitude, offered a degree of warmth and sunlight as heat from the great hall rose to them. However, even these seemingly private spaces were often shared with personal servants, ladies in waiting, or squires, who might sleep at the foot of the bed or on pallets on the floor. The practice of keeping records of bedroom arrangements for legal or religious reasons further highlights the limited nature of intimate privacy, even for the elite. The emergence of more private spaces for the nobility thus signifies privacy as a marker of social status and a developing concept over the medieval period, rather than an inherent human right. The contrast between peasant and noble living conditions clearly links privacy with wealth and power, indicating a hierarchical degree of seclusion. Yet, despite this constant presence, the bed itself became a central, albeit covert, space for intimacy and candid conversation. Beds were prized possessions, often the most expensive item in a home, and were multifunctional, used for eating, conducting business, and sleeping. Within these shared environments, private moments were snatched whenever and wherever possible, often under the cover of blankets in the dark, with couples striving for minimal noise. The bed, in this context, acted as a neutral territory where intimate boundaries could be redrawn, allowing wives, for instance, to express concerns unsuited to other hours. This demonstrates a remarkable human adaptability in finding intimate moments within public settings, suggesting that while physical privacy was absent, a form of psychological intimacy could still be cultivated. Travelling in medieval times offered little respite from communal living. Inns frequently featured shared beds, meaning total strangers might sleep side by side for the night. This arrangement, described as quite common, complicated any desire for affection. While etiquette dictated that bedmates should lie still and not hog the blankets, the sheer proximity made intimate encounters challenging. This widespread practice of shared beds, even among strangers, indicates a societal normalization of physical proximity that is vastly different from modern Western norms, suggesting a different cultural understanding of personal space and boundaries. This normalization likely stemmed from practical needs such as warmth and security in an era without central heating or advanced security systems. The rules governing shared sleeping, such as remaining still, highlight that while proximity was accepted, there were still unspoken social contracts governing behaviour within these shared spaces. The sensory environment of medieval life was also far removed from modern sensibilities, profoundly influencing intimate interactions. Homes, whether peasant huts or grand castles, were often cold and smoky due to central hearths and poor ventilation. Rushes, occasionally swept up, covered floors to provide some fragrance. Personal hygiene was a lower priority than basic survival, such as avoiding plague or fixing a roof. Bathing was infrequent, perhaps once a month for peasants, and soap was either homemade or an expensive import used sparingly. Public bathhouses existed in towns and cities, but their operation was sometimes suspended during outbreaks of disease or scandal. Water itself, particularly cold water, was occasionally viewed with suspicion, believed by some to weaken the body or open the skin to illness. While the wealthy had more options for hot, scented baths, the poor often resorted to cold bucket sponge baths. Despite the infrequency of full baths, daily ablutions, washing hands, face and mouth were common across all classes, often performed immediately upon waking. Perfume was mostly for the elite and primarily used for masking unpleasant odours rather than enhancing natural scents, as modern deodorants were non-existent. Dental care was rudimentary, involving rubbing teeth with ash or chewing mint leaves. This pervasive medieval musk meant that when everyone smelled equally awful, attraction was perhaps truly blind and nose blind. The medieval understanding of senses was also distinct. They were not merely passive receptors, but active transmitters of physical, moral, and spiritual qualities. This permeable self meant that intimate interactions were not just physical acts, but deeply sensory and potentially morally charged exchanges, where even smells could carry moral connotations. The constant presence of people and animals, combined with a lack of soundproofing, meant that intimate sounds were likely common, further contributing to this permeable sensory experience. This suggests a deeper, more holistic, and less compartmentalized understanding of the body and its interactions in medieval intimacy. In the medieval world, few institutions shaped private life more profoundly than the church, which held extensive and often strict opinions on what transpired behind closed doors, or, more accurately, behind shared curtains. The church's teachings on physical intimacy were clear and unwavering. Its primary function was singular: reproduction. Pleasure, bonding, or stress relief were, at best, considered distracting, and at worst, outright sinful. This doctrine was not merely Sunday sermon material. Bishops, theologians, and confessors meticulously detailed what was and was not acceptable, leaving little room for improvisation. The preferred method for marital relations was the missionary position, not solely for its religious symbolism, but because it was deemed the most natural and thus the least likely to offend God, the saints, or the local priest. Any other position or enthusiasm was considered suspect and potentially sinful. The Church's strict emphasis on procreation as the sole purpose of sex coupled with its condemnation of pleasure, created a fundamental tension within marital intimacy, revealing a disconnect between theological ideals and human nature. A 13th century guide, for instance, suggested married couples engage in intimacy without pleasure, without sin, and without delay, a checklist that sounds fairly joyless. Thomas Aquinas, a highly influential theologian, warned that a man who engaged in sex with his wife solely for pleasure was akin to treating her like a prostitute. Yet the Church also acknowledged that pleasure was believed to enable conception, creating a paradox where pleasure was a necessary evil for the divinely ordained purpose of procreation. This inherent contradiction likely caused psychological strain for devout couples, as they were encouraged to engage in an act while simultaneously being warned against its natural enjoyable outcome. Furthermore, the Church's idealization of celibacy and asceticism, initially for clergy, permeated lay society, shaping a moral hierarchy where sexual renunciation was seen as spiritually superior to even marital procreation. Celibacy was lauded as the highest form of spiritual discipline. Monks and nuns took explicit vows of celibacy, and even married couples were encouraged to live in continence, abstaining entirely, especially if they were older or considered holier. The belief that celibacy was superior to marriage, even to the point of suggesting celibacy marriage burning in hell, clearly established a rigid hierarchy of sexual approaches. This widespread promotion of sexual renunciation, even within marriage, indicates a deep-seated suspicion of the carnal and a desire to elevate the spiritual, profoundly impacting the emotional and physical lives of all Christians. The Church imposed strict prohibitions on when intimacy was allowed, transforming the calendar into a divine obstacle course for couples. Certain days of the week were off-limits. Sundays, as the Lord's Day, were strictly forbidden, as were Fridays, days of penance, and even Wednesdays, which were viewed with suspicion. Beyond weekly restrictions, major feast days, fasting days, holy days, and entire liturgical seasons like Lent 40 days and Advent another 40 days were also prohibited. Some confession manuals even outlined nearly half the year as off-limits for intimacy. Furthermore, intimacy was to be avoided during a woman's menstruation, pregnancy, and lactation, beliefs found in both clerical and medical sources throughout the Middle Ages. Some folk beliefs even linked sexual timing to certain moon phases. Intimacy during these forbidden times could lead to spiritual guilt, an extra trip to confession, or even the belief that it could result in sickly children or divine punishment. The extensive list of forbidden days demonstrates the Church's ambition to regulate even the most private aspects of life, but this maximalist approach likely led to widespread, quiet non-compliance and a disconnect between official doctrine and lived reality. The sheer volume of off-limits, days, potentially nearly half the year, highlights the extreme attempt at control over marital intimacy. The metaphor of the divine obstacle course vividly portrays the impracticality of strict adherence for the average couple. Historical accounts suggest that many lay people, particularly peasants, simply smiled, nodded, and did what they were going to do anyway, quietly. This indicates a significant gap between the ideal and the lived reality. The uneven enforcement and regional variations further illustrate the challenges of imposing such universal rules. This suggests that while the Church aimed for total control, its practical reach was limited by human nature and local conditions, leading to a culture of quiet defiance and selective adherence. Confession played a central role in the Church's attempts to regulate sexual morality. Priests, armed with detailed confession manuals, asked pointed and specific questions to determine if couples had broken any moral or ecclesiastical guidelines. These inquiries were often uncomfortably specific, giving the average 14th century friar far more knowledge about his parishioners' bedrooms than their birthdays. Penances for sexual sins were varied and often severe. They could range from spiritual acts like fasting for years or repetitions of psalms to public humiliation such as parading through the village in nothing but a shift, or financial penalties like fines or forfeiture of property. Children born of sex during a forbidden period could even be considered bastards. Confession was not merely a spiritual act, but a powerful mechanism for the Church to exert social control, gather intimate data, and enforce its moral code, even if imperfectly. The detailed instructions and pointed questions in confession manuals reveal a systematic approach to monitoring private life. The range of penances, from spiritual to public shaming and financial, demonstrates the Church's multifaceted enforcement. This system, while not always effective, aimed to shape behaviour by instilling fear of spiritual and social consequences, making the confessional a key site for social engineering. Medieval canon law also recognised the concept of marital debt, an obligation for both husband and wife to provide sexual intercourse upon demand. This concept, derived from Pauline epistles, meant that denying a spouse could be grounds for complaint or even annulment. While the Church emphasised verbal consent for the initial marriage contract, even allowing it to be valid without a priest present in some cases, within marriage, the concept of marital rape did not exist. This highlights a significant legal and ethical double standard for women. While initial consent was vital for marriage validity, the marital debt doctrine effectively negated ongoing consent within the marriage. The explicit statement that the concept of marital rape did not exist in the Middle Ages reveals a legal framework where a wife's body was considered her husband's right, effectively overriding her personal autonomy within the marriage. This creates a direct contradiction. Initial consent was paramount, but continuous consent within the marriage was not legally recognised, leading to potential coercion under the guise of marital obligation. In medieval Europe, the path to matrimony was less about the flutter of hearts and more about the strategic alignment of households. Romance, as understood in modern times, was largely secondary to the practical realities of survival and social advancement. Marriage was predominantly a business deal, a legally binding agreement to cement alliances, acquire property, or secure peace between families who might otherwise feud over something as mundane as whose pig ate whose cabbage. The economic pragmatism over romantic idealism was a defining characteristic of medieval unions. Daughters were exchanged to forge alliances, secure property, or establish peace, with their personal desires often taking a backseat to familial and dynastic needs. A bride typically brought a dowry which could consist of coin, linens, or a patch of farmland. This dowry was not merely a gift, it represented the bride's contribution to the new household and served as a form of security for her, particularly in the event of widowhood. In return, the groom's family might offer promises, perhaps as simple as not to be entirely insufferable. Parental consent was often paramount, especially among the nobility, who negotiated marriages like chess moves, with the young lady's opinion politely requested or strongly implied, but ultimately superseded by the dowry. This emphasis on material assets and alliances over personal affection highlights a societal structure where individual desires were often subsumed by family and lineage requirements. The motivations for marriage varied significantly by social class. For the nobility, marriages were critical for maintaining vast estates, forging political alliances, and ensuring dynastic continuity through legitimate heirs. For the peasantry, unions were more about immediate economic stability, securing access to land and tools, and providing a labour force for the household. Despite these differences, the overarching goal was the creation of a functioning, productive unit that would generate children and uphold social standing. This contrasts sharply with modern Western romantic ideals, where love is typically the prerequisite for marriage. Courtship, when it did occur, was a heavily supervised affair. Young people rarely found themselves alone. A maiden might be watched over by her mother, a stern aunt, or even an entire village deeply invested in whether or not she held hands. Among the nobility, arranged matches were the norm, with affection expected to develop later, if at all. For peasants, a man's suitability was judged by practical concerns such as his land, tools, or the size of his ox, while women were evaluated on their housekeeping skills, reputation, and ability to avoid market drama. Betrothals, often referred to as handfasting, were informal engagements where a couple considered themselves betrothed, and in some regions, this was legally sufficient to begin cohabiting. These informal vows, known as present vows, sponsalia per verba de presenti, could constitute a valid marriage even without a priest present, based solely on the verbal consent of both parties. This process of marriage, rather than a single event, highlights the Church's later efforts to formalise and centralise marital authority. The fluidity of early medieval marriage customs, where informal betrothals and cohabitation often preceded formal church blessings, led to legal and social ambiguities. For instance, disputes arose over whether a couple had merely talked and fornicated or exchanged promises of marriage and consummated the union. In response to these complexities and potential abuses, such as clandestine marriages that could obscure incestuous impediments, the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 mandated public announcements, bans, and the presence of a priest for a marriage to be recognised as valid. This demonstrates a clear causal relationship. Informal practices led to legal and social problems, prompting the Church to formalise and centralise marital authority, thereby shaping the modern understanding of marriage as a sacrament. Despite the rigid social structures and practical motivations, love found a way to bloom in the cracks of medieval society. The persistence of human affection, even in a system prioritising practicality, reveals the enduring human need for emotional connection, suggesting that romantic love is not solely a modern construct. The common saying, "This doesn't mean love didn't exist." It did, but it usually came after marriage, not before, encapsulates this reality. Affection was considered a bonus, not a requirement, an emotional DLC, not included in the base marriage package. Yet, historical records reveal instances of couples genuinely marrying for love, sometimes eloping or rebelling against matches arranged by their parents, much to the horror of family accountants. Letters exchanged between spouses, particularly during periods of separation, often reveal profound affection, longing, and commitment, indicating that strong emotional partnerships were built over time. Even widows and widowers, free from the dynastic pressures of first marriages, sometimes remarried for companionship rather than political gain, choosing someone they genuinely wished to spend their remaining years with. This demonstrates that despite external pressures and structural constraints, human emotional needs found ways to flourish, suggesting a universal aspect of human relationships that transcends historical periods and societal norms. In the tightly controlled social landscape of medieval Europe, where formal courtship was supervised and marriage was often a strategic alliance, romantic and sexual desires inevitably sought unsanctioned side quests. Despite the pervasive scrutiny and strict moral codes, individuals found ingenious ways to flirt, meet, and engage in premarital intimacy, often leading to a complex interplay between personal will and societal consequence. Secret flirtations, playful songs, and moonlit walks to the village well became the clandestine avenues of medieval dating. Young people, particularly commoners who enjoyed slightly more freedom in choosing their partners, would gather for dancing, eating, and general socializing on Saturdays, creating opportunities to meet prospective mates. Some courtship rituals were truly unusual, such as the practice in medieval England, where women would soak an apple in their sweat and offer it to the man they desired, believing its consumption would expose him to her scent and inspire affection. This practice, reportedly lasting until the Elizabethan era and even into the 19th century in rural Austria, exemplifies the human ingenuity in circumventing restrictions. The existence of these unsanctioned side quests and peculiar rituals demonstrates a remarkable human creativity and persistence in pursuing romantic and sexual desires despite formidable societal and religious constraints. This highlights that human desire is a powerful force that adapts and finds expression even in highly regulated environments, indicating a persistent gap between official morality and lived experience. Intimacy before marriage, or fornication in the Church's lexicon, was common enough to generate a lot of paperwork in church records. Local officials meticulously maintained moral rolls, which were essentially ledgers of shame, to document and fine couples caught or even suspected of jumping the marital timeline. The fines levied varied depending on whether it was a first offence, if a pregnancy resulted, or if the couple eventually married. Indeed, a premarital pregnancy often served as a catalyst, hurrying the couple along to the altar. A peculiar practice known as bundling allowed courting couples to share a bed, fully clothed, and sometimes separated by a bundling board, ostensibly for conversation and getting to know each other within the safe confines of the girl's home. While presented as a nod to the church, this practice frequently resulted in intimacy, with the understanding that marriage would follow if a pregnancy occurred. The widespread practice of premarital intimacy, often leading to pregnancy before marriage, suggests a pragmatic, de facto trial period for fertility and compatibility. This was often tolerated by communities despite official church condemnation. The high rates of premarital conception, with 20 to 40% of first births conceived before the wedding, and the practice of bundling clearly indicate that sexual activity before formal marriage was common, especially among commoners. The prevailing sentiment that nobody really cared about premarital sex as long as the couple got married, and that pregnancy could further hurry the engaged couple to the altar, demonstrates a societal pragmatism where the outcome, a legitimate marriage and children, often outweighed the sin of premarital sex. This reveals a societal understanding that, while the church condemned fornication, the practical need for heirs and stable family units often led to a more lenient, if unofficial, acceptance of premarital sexual activity. The social consequences of unsanctioned intimacy could be severe, acting as a powerful deterrent. In tight-knit communities, gossip spread with astonishing speed, faster than plague rats, and any hint of scandal could lead to public shame, the loss of a dowry, or an awkward, pointed sermon. Public whippings were a common punishment for fornication, designed to inflict social humiliation and serve as a public example. Women, in particular, faced ruined reputations and significant social stigma. Beyond formal legal or ecclesiastical punishments, the community itself acted as a powerful moral enforcer through these social mechanisms. The initial document highlights that your neighbours weren't merciful, even if the priest was, and that gossip travelled faster than plague rats. The consequences of shame, gossip, or a strongly worded sermon, and public penances were designed to inflict social humiliation. This indicates that social reputation and community standing were immensely important, often more immediately impactful than formal legal repercussions. This system of informal social control, driven by close-knit communities, created a constant pressure to conform to perceived norms, even if those norms were more flexible than official church doctrine. Few images are as stubbornly persistent in the popular imagination of the Middle Ages as the chastity belt. This iron contraption, allegedly locked around a woman's waist by her husband before he departed for war, is a staple of cartoons, historical dramas, and even unfortunate museum gift shops. The enduring image portrays medieval women as repressed, over-controlled, and their fidelity literally shackled. Yet, this widely accepted notion is, in fact, one of the biggest historical myths surrounding medieval sexuality. The enduring popularity of the chastity belt myth, despite historical inaccuracies, reveals more about later eras anxieties and perceptions of medieval repression than it does about medieval reality. There is no solid historical evidence that chastity belts were ever widely used in the Middle Ages. Most of the existing examples of these devices date from the Renaissance or even the Victorian era, periods that were arguably more obsessed with the idea of medieval repression than with what actually transpired. Many of these belts were created as joke items, warnings, or museum curiosities designed to fit a narrative of a repressed, over-controlled medieval woman. This highlights how historical narratives can be shaped by the biases and cultural needs of later periods, projecting contemporary concerns onto the past. The myth's persistence, even into modern times, demonstrates how easily a compelling, albeit false, story can overshadow factual evidence. The reality of the chastity belt is one of impracticality and historical silence. Medieval manuscripts, which often meticulously recorded all sorts of uncomfortable details, are conspicuously silent about any widespread distribution or use of such devices. No tailor advertised them, no laws regulated their use, and no churches are recorded as handing them out during marriage ceremonies. The design itself was wildly impractical. Given the rudimentary state of medieval hygiene, adding a rusty metal contraption with no user manual and a padlock that likely required a blacksmith would have caused more infections and suffering than it prevented indiscretions. The earliest detailed mention of what could be interpreted as a chastity belt appears in Conrad Kieser von Eichstätt's Bellefortis 1405, a book on military technology, but even this reference is widely believed to be humorous or satirical. The absence of practical and textual evidence, coupled with the clear impracticality of the device, strongly supports the conclusion that chastity belts were not a widely used medieval reality. The lack of references in serious medieval texts, tailor advertisements, or legal religious regulations is a crucial indicator. The detailed understanding of medieval hygiene with infrequent bathing and limited cleaning agents, makes the idea of wearing a rusty metal contraption for extended periods medically absurd, leading to the conclusion that it would have caused more infections than it prevented indiscretions. This combination of historical silence and practical impossibility provides compelling evidence against its widespread use, illustrating how critical thinking about historical context can dismantle popular myths. In reality, fidelity was enforced through more traditional and far more effective means: shame, pervasive surveillance, religious doctrine, and strategic matchmaking. Noble women were often chaperoned within an inch of their lives, their movements and interactions closely monitored. Peasant girls, lacking the formal chaperones of the elite, were under the constant watchful eye of their entire village, who acted like unpaid private investigators. Any whiff of scandal or perceived misbehaviour could lead to devastating consequences, including a ruined reputation, the loss of a dowry, or awkward public confessions that exposed intimate details. The actual mechanisms of fidelity enforcement relied heavily on social pressure, public scrutiny, and the economic consequences of a tarnished reputation, demonstrating a powerful, albeit invisible, system of control. Instead of a physical belt, medieval society used shame, surveillance, religion, and strategic matchmaking to enforce fidelity. The constant watching by communities and the chaperonage for noble women served as pervasive, non-physical barriers. The severe consequences of scandal, such as ruined reputations and lost dowries, and public shaming, directly impacted a woman's social and economic standing. This highlights that societal norms and the fear of public disgrace were far more effective in controlling female sexuality than any mythical iron device. The honour of the family was intrinsically tied to female purity, making female fidelity a communal concern. In a surprising twist that often challenges modern perceptions of medieval morality, many urban centres across medieval Europe did not merely tolerate prostitution, they actively regulated it. This pragmatic approach to a perceived social necessity reveals a nuanced understanding of human behaviour and societal order. In several parts of medieval Europe, particularly in urban centres like Bolzano, Hall, Innsbruck, Murano, London Southwark, and Dijon, brothels operated as legal, regulated businesses. Town councils licensed these establishments, charged taxes on their earnings, and even designated specific red light districts. Long before the invention of the light bulb, some cities went as far as employing officials, colourfully known as brothel keepers or keepers of public women, to manage these houses. The rationale behind this arrangement was pragmatic, if a little cynical. Officials believed that allowing a controlled outlet for men's desires would reduce the chances of greater sins like adultery, assault, or even, heaven forbid, dancing. St. Augustine's influential view that if you remove harlots from society, everything will be unsettled on account of lusts was frequently cited to justify this necessary evil. The official regulation and taxation of brothels, despite the Church's condemnation of fornication, reveals a significant societal pragmatism where maintaining social order and preventing greater evils took precedence over strict moral adherence. This direct contradiction to the Church's official stance against non-procreative sex highlights a critical tension between religious doctrine and practical governance, where the state found ways to manage human behaviour that the Church could only condemn. Life within these stews, as brothels were often called, was far from a fairy tale, yet it was also not necessarily a life of constant misery. Some women chose the profession for economic reasons, particularly widows or those without family support, while others were coerced or trafficked, especially in bustling port cities. Handbooks existed for managing these houses, outlining rules for clean sheets, basic health inspections, and set hours, indicating a degree of institutionalization. Patrons came from all social classes: knights, apprentices, merchants, and even monks, despite their vows, frequented these establishments. Entry fees varied, and in some cases, customers paid in goods like eggs or wool, reflecting a flexible economy. The complex reality of public women was shaped by a complex interplay of economic necessity, coercion, and a surprising degree of regulation, challenging simplistic notions of their wild existence. While often seen as fallen, prostitutes were also a recognised, and sometimes protected, part of urban society. The existence of handbooks for brothel management, detailing requirements for clean sheets, basic health inspections, and set hours, indicates a level of institutionalization and concern for public health. The fact that women chose the profession for economic reasons highlights the limited options available to women without family support or dowries. The diverse clientele further underscores the pervasive demand for their services across social strata, making their lives a microcosm of broader societal contradictions. Despite the existence of some regulations, sexually transmitted diseases (STDs) were a reality, and their presence added a complex layer to the public health landscape of medieval cities. Medieval medical theory often linked disease to sexual sin, viewing ailments like leprosy as a consequence of illicit sexual behaviour. Brothels were sometimes banned during outbreaks of disease, reflecting a rudimentary understanding of contagion. Some regulations even aimed to banish women with burning sickness, likely gonorrhea, from the local stews. Remedies suggested for post-coital cleansing included washing with urine or vinegar, indicating attempts at antiseptic practices. The interplay of morality, medicine, and public health in medieval society viewed STDs through a lens that combined moral judgment, rudimentary medical understanding, often based on humoral theory, and nascent public health concerns, leading to varied and often ineffective responses. The belief that sexual sin brought divine punishment and the attribution of diseases like leprosy to brothel visits show a strong moralistic interpretation of illness. However, there was also a practical, albeit limited, medical response, such as banishing infected women and recommending cleansing agents. This demonstrates a societal attempt to reconcile religious condemnation with the observable realities of disease, leading to a blend of spiritual and practical, but often unscientific public health measures. The medieval world was a place of intense sensory experiences, far removed from the climate-controlled, scent-managed environments of today. Understanding the realities of personal hygiene and the prevailing sensory landscape is crucial to comprehending intimate life in an era where the body's truths were often unmasked. Bathing habits in medieval Europe were not as frequent as modern sensibilities might hope. For peasants, a full bath might occur only once a month, or more often if they accidentally fell into a river. Soap, when available, was either homemade or an expensive import, used sparingly. Public bathhouses existed in towns and cities, serving as important social meeting places, but their operation was sometimes curtailed during outbreaks of disease or scandal. Water itself, particularly cold water, was occasionally viewed with suspicion, with some believing that frequent bathing could weaken the body or open the skin to illness. The wealthy, of course, had more options, able to afford hot, scented baths drawn by attendants. Despite the infrequency of full-body immersion, daily ablutions, washing hands, face and mouth, were common across all social classes, often performed immediately upon waking. The notion that medieval people were universally dirty is a misconception. Hygiene was a spectrum of practice and perception, influenced by class, region, and evolving medical theories, leading to a different sensory baseline for intimacy. While full bathing was infrequent, daily ablutions were a recognized practice, and public bathhouses were popular social centers. The suspicion of water, due to beliefs about pores and contagion, highlights the influence of medical theory on practice, where it was thought that warm water opened pores, allowing disease to enter the body. This suggests that medieval people did care about cleanliness, but their methods and understanding differed significantly from modern ones, creating a sensory environment where different levels of cleanliness were socially acceptable for intimate encounters. Given the infrequent bathing, masking unpleasant scents was a practical necessity. Perfume was primarily for the elite, and the concept of modern deodorant was a distant dream. Instead, people used scented oils, burned incense, and incorporated fragrant herbs like rosemary, saffron, and cloves to cover pervasive odours. Clothing, typically consisting of multiple layers of wool, leather, linen, and fur, trapped heat, sweat, and every scent encountered throughout the day, from chamber pots to mystery stews. This indicates that scent served as both a social indicator and a practical necessity. The use of perfumes and scented herbs primarily for masking odours, rather than enhancing natural ones, reflects a practical adaptation to the pervasive sensory environment and a social stratification of scent. The statement that unpleasant smells were probably much more prevalent is a logical consequence of the limited bathing practices. The use of perfumes and herbs to mask unpleasant odours was a direct response to this reality. The fact that perfume was mostly for the elite and served as a status symbol indicates that control over one's scent was a marker of wealth and social standing. This suggests that intimate encounters occurred within a sensory landscape where strong natural body odours were common, and artificial scents were used to cover rather than complement, highlighting a different cultural approach to personal presentation and attraction. Dental care was rudimentary. People might rub their teeth with ash or chew mint leaves if they were fancy, making kissing a truly adventurous endeavour. The overall sensory environment of medieval daily life was a permeable experience. Homes were rarely quiet or empty, filled with the sounds of family, servants, apprentices, and animals. The air could be thick with smoke from central hearths. The absence of electricity meant that nights were deeply dark and quiet, devoid of the constant hum of modern engines and televisions. Beyond the physical, sensory perception itself was understood differently. Senses were not just passive receptors of information, but were believed to be active transmitters of physical, moral, and spiritual qualities. This concept of the permeable self meant that external sensory input and output were deeply intertwined with moral and spiritual meaning, influencing how intimacy was perceived and experienced. Smells, for instance, could carry moral and spiritual connotations, and even bad things could be transmitted through sight. This suggests that intimacy was not just a physical act, but a deeply sensory and potentially morally charged exchange. The constant presence of others and the lack of soundproofing meant that intimate sounds were likely common, further contributing to this permeable sensory experience, implying a deeper, more holistic, and less compartmentalized understanding of the body and its interactions in medieval intimacy. In medieval Europe, controlling the size of one's family was akin to trying to steer a cart with no wheels and an uncooperative goat. Despite the formidable challenges and the church's stringent prohibitions, medieval people were far from oblivious to the link between certain behaviours and babies, and many went to elaborate, often baffling, lengths to prevent conception. The array of methods employed for family planning highlights a strong societal desire for control over reproduction that far outstripped the available scientific knowledge and technology. People resorted to a mix of herbal remedies and folk wisdom. Some of the more scientific approaches included drinking wine boiled with beaver testicles, consuming herbal mixtures like parsley, pennyroyal, and mint, or even more exotic ingredients like garlic, arum, opium, and peony. Early versions of barrier methods also existed, though their reliability was questionable. These included linens soaked in various concoctions, wax, or even animal membranes, which served as medieval prototypes for later devices. Vaginal suppositories made from wool steeped in gummy substances like cedar oil or gum arabic were also used, and some recipes even included crocodile dung for its sticky texture and symbolic potency. Folkloric rituals were also common, such as burying certain objects near the doorstep, wearing blessed amulets, or vigorously jumping up and down after intimacy. The wide array of often bizarre and ineffective contraceptive methods underscores a strong societal desire for family planning that far outstripped the available scientific knowledge and technology. The sheer variety of methods, from the scientifically dubious to the outright bizarre, demonstrates the desperation and lack of reliable scientific understanding. The low reliability of these methods and their frequent failure, often leading to hasty marriages and hidden pregnancies, highlights the persistent gap between human intention and practical outcome, revealing a society grappling with fundamental biological realities using a mix of folk wisdom, rudimentary science, and magical thinking. The Church, of course, was decidedly not amused by any attempts to avoid conception, labelling them as sinful or unnatural. Procreation was the stated goal of marriage, and anything that interfered with this divine mission was frowned upon, or more commonly denounced loudly from the pulpit. Contraception was sometimes equated with homicide or interference with nature, with theologians like St. Jerome arguing that taking potions to ensure barrenness was akin to murder human beings almost before their conception. The penances for contraception were severe, ranging from 3 to 15 years of fasting or other forms of penance. The Church's condemnation of contraception as unnatural highlights a theological framework that prioritized divine will procreation over human agency, viewing any deviation from this as a grave moral transgression. The extreme moral weight placed on this issue is evident in the equating of contraception with homicide and the severe penances imposed. This reveals a theological worldview where human sexuality was seen as a tool for God's plan of multiplication, and any attempt to subvert this purpose was an affront to divine order. The concept of unnatural acts was central to this condemnation, extending beyond contraception to other non-procreative sexual acts. When contraception failed, medieval women, facing immense social pressure and dire consequences for illegitimate births, sometimes resorted to abortion or infanticide. Abortion methods primarily involved herbal remedies and various physical actions, such as strenuous labour, climbing, or even tightening a girdle. The Church officially condemned abortion, though the severity of the sin depended on whether the fetus was considered formed or ensouled, typically marked by the perception of fetal movement, known as quickening. Medieval laws concerning abortion often focused on the crime against the husband's potential heir rather than the woman's autonomy or well-being. While infanticide was generally considered a crime, prosecution for abortion was remarkably rare, often left to the Church to assign penance, rather than being pursued by secular authorities. The existence of abortion and infanticide, despite legal and religious prohibitions, points to the desperate circumstances faced by women seeking to control their reproductive lives in a world with ineffective contraception and severe social consequences for illegitimate births. The text notes that when contraception failed, hasty marriages, hidden pregnancies, and a lot of awkward conversations came in. The mention of abortion and infanticide as alternatives, even if condemned, highlights the extreme pressures on medieval women, particularly unmarried mothers. The rarity of prosecution for abortion suggests a practical difficulty in enforcement and a societal tendency to defer such sins to ecclesiastical rather than secular courts. This implies a hidden and often tragic struggle for reproductive autonomy, where women resorted to dangerous and illicit means to manage their family size in the face of overwhelming social and religious expectations. In medieval Europe, a woman's virginity was far more than a personal virtue. It was a profound societal construct, functioning as a contract clause, a political tool, and occasionally a community-wide obsession. This emphasis on female virginity reveals a patriarchal societal structure where a woman's body and reproductive potential were primarily economic and political assets, rather than aspects of her personal autonomy. For noble women, virginity was intrinsically linked to inheritance, the formation of strategic alliances, and the honour of the family. A pregnancy outside of wedlock could derail generations of meticulous dynastic planning, jeopardising property claims and social standing. For the peasantry, while expectations varied by region and circumstance, a young woman was generally expected to arrive at marriage untested, at least officially. The explicit phrasing virginity was a contract clause, a political tool, and occasionally a community-wide obsession and a valuable bargaining chip, directly indicates its economic and social function. The direct link to inheritance, alliances, and family honour demonstrates that female virginity served to ensure legitimate heirs and maintain family power structures. This reduced women to a means to an end, with their worth being tied to their unsoiled status. This highlights a systemic objectification where female bodies were controlled for male lineage and societal stability. The religious symbolism of virginity was also deeply intertwined with the cult of the Virgin Mary, who was held up as the ultimate exemplar of purity and sanctity, further reinforcing societal expectations for women. The methods employed to verify a woman's virginity were often invasive, unreliable, and sometimes led to elaborate deceptions. Verification was frequently done badly. Methods included vague testimony, such as, "she seemed virtuous," or more invasive inspections by midwives for the presence of the hymen. Post-wedding, the display of a blood-stained sheet was sometimes expected as proof of consummation and virginity. However, modern science has since confirmed that the hymen is not a reliable chastity barometer. Recognizing the societal pressure and the unreliability of these tests, women devised ingenious methods to fake virginity. These included placing leeches on their labia to create a wound that would bleed on the wedding night, or discreetly spilling animal blood such as chicken blood onto the sheets under the cover of darkness. Folkloric tests also existed, such as having a woman drink large amounts of a diuretic and observing whether she could refrain from urinating, or examining her urine for clarity. The reliance on unreliable and invasive methods for virginity testing, coupled with women's ability to deceive, reveals a societal obsession with a concept that was fundamentally difficult, if not impossible, to definitively prove. The methods described were based on flawed anatomical understanding and were easily circumvented by clever women, indicating their agency in navigating these oppressive expectations. This creates a tension between the societal demand for proof and the inherent impossibility of obtaining it reliably, suggesting that the proof was often more about upholding social appearances and patriarchal control than factual verification. A stark double standard existed regarding male and female virginity, underscoring the deeply patriarchal nature of medieval society. Men were under no such scrutiny. Male virginity was considered an optional bonus, and a future husband's experience level was rarely questioned. At most, men might be encouraged to avoid tavern maids or loose company, but no one was checking their laundry the next morning for evidence of premarital encounters. This double standard was deeply ingrained in medieval society, where male sexual freedom was tacitly accepted while female sexuality was rigidly controlled for the benefit of male lineage and social order. The explicit statement that men, of course, were under no such scrutiny. Male virginity was considered an optional bonus, stands in stark contrast to the intense pressure and invasive scrutiny faced by women. This reveals a fundamental power imbalance where women's bodies were seen as property and their sexuality controlled to ensure paternity and family honour. Male sexual activity, even outside marriage, was often tolerated or seen as less problematic. This double standard is a clear manifestation of gendered power dynamics, where different rules applied based on sex, reflecting a society structured to benefit men. The existence of same-sex attraction and relationships in medieval Europe is a historical reality, demonstrating that human nature did not begin in the 20th century. However, the official stance of medieval society, heavily influenced by the dominant religious doctrine, was one of strong condemnation, often labelling same-sex intimacy as unnatural acts. Officially, the Church categorised same-sex intimacy as a sin, frequently lumping it together with other unnatural acts, like dancing on feast days or reading too many books. By the 11th century, sodomy became an increasingly serious moral crime, punishable by mutilation or even death. The term sodomy itself was a broad, utterly confused category that encompassed any non-procreative sexual act, including oral sex, anal sex, masturbation, and bestiality, not exclusively same-sex relations. The theologian Thomas Aquinas, highly influential in the 13th century, further solidified this condemnation by linking same-sex acts to the idea of natural law, arguing that they ran counter to the intercourse of male and female natural to animals, and were therefore peculiarly qualified as unnatural. He considered it second only to bestiality as an abuse of sexuality. This theological framework viewed any non-procreative act as a violation of God's design for human sexuality. Punishments for same-sex intimacy varied wildly depending on the region, time period, and social status of those involved. A peasant couple might receive a scolding and penance, while nobles might face exile or be quietly ignored if they held sufficient land. In the early medieval years, homosexuality was given no particular penance, viewed like other sins. However, by the 11th century, attitudes hardened. Pope Gregory III in the 8th century prescribed penances of 160 days for unnatural female acts, and usually 1 year for males who committed acts of sodomy, with the passive partner often treated more severely. By the 13th century in France, sodomy could result. Punishments for same-sex intimacy varied wildly depending on the region, time period, and social status of those involved. A peasant couple might receive a scolding and penance, while nobles might face exile or be quietly ignored if they held sufficient land. In the early medieval years, homosexuality was given no particular penance, viewed like other sins. However, by the 11th century, attitudes hardened. Pope Gregory III in the 8th century prescribed penances of 160 days for unnatural female acts, and usually 1 year for males who committed acts of sodomy, with the passive partner often treated more severely. By the 13th century in France, sodomy could result in castration for a first offence, dismemberment for a second, and burning at the stake for a third. Lesbian behaviour was punished with specific mutilations for the first 2 offences and burning for the third. In some Italian cities by the mid-14th century, civil laws against sodomy were common, with punishments ranging from fines to burning the participants or the location where the act occurred. Florence, for example, established the Office of the Knight in 1432 specifically to prosecute sodomy, imposing heavy fines and even castration for pederasty. The criminalisation of same-sex activity in the Latin West may have been an unintended consequence of Western European polemic against Muslim societies, as the Council of Nablus in 1120 enacted severe penalties for sodomy in the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem, linking it to military defeats. This highlights the increasing severity of official condemnation over time, particularly as the Church consolidated its power and sought to enforce a rigid moral order. In medieval Europe, adultery was not merely a personal failing, it was a significant social offence, akin to handling a live chicken while juggling knives, risky, loud, and likely to end with someone losing pride or property. Marriage was viewed not only as a holy sacrament but also as a legal contract, a property deal, and often a strategic alliance. When someone strayed, they were not just breaking hearts, they were tampering with inheritances, dowries, and the always fragile local gossip equilibrium. The stakes for women caught in an affair were significantly higher than for men. A married woman caught in adultery could face public shaming, loss of dowry rights, forced penance, or even exile, particularly if she was caught with clear evidence. Adulterous noblewomen might find themselves imprisoned, divorced, or discreetly removed from court life, a fate often more akin to a scarlet exit than a scarlet letter. In Germanic tradition, a husband who caught his wife in the act could shave her hair, strip her naked, flog her through the village, and banish her from his house, ensuring public shame and difficulty in finding another spouse. Some Germanic laws even permitted the murder of the adulterous wife. The main reasons for this severe stigma against women were the desire for purity of bloodlines and the assurance of paternity. A child of uncertain paternity could taint the family's lineage. Women were often considered the property of the men in their lives, fathers or husbands, making female adultery more a crime of property than of sex. Men, on the other hand, generally received more leeway. A married man having an affair with an unmarried woman might be seen as morally suspect, but he was rarely legally punished, unless the woman's family had powerful friends or the church was feeling unusually righteous that week. This double standard was deeply ingrained, reflecting a patriarchal society where male sexual freedom was largely accepted, while female sexuality was rigidly controlled for the benefit of male lineage and social order. However, not all adulterers, male or female, escaped punishment. Some towns imposed steep fines or required public confession. Creative punishments included parading through the village in nothing but a shift, or having to pay for a new church bell, a form of divine justice through bronze acoustics. The real danger, however, was often not the law, but the cuckolded husband. Honour killings were not unheard of, particularly among nobles, where medieval custom sometimes allowed a man to take appropriate action, the definition of which depended heavily on his status and how many swords he owned. For the wealthy, affairs could spiral into full-blown scandals, annulments, or decades-long family feuds. For peasants, the consequences were usually financial. A fine here, a goat forfeited there, and a permanent place in village gossip. The psychological impact of fidelity enforcement was significant, with public spectacles of punishment designed to instill fear and obedience among the masses. This system of honour and shame, deeply intertwined with physical violence and reputation, ensured that individuals were constantly aware of the social consequences of their actions. The concept of consent in medieval Europe existed, but it was far from the modern understanding of mutual respect and enthusiastic affirmation. Instead, it was a complex notion, deeply entangled in legal codes, dowries, church doctrine, and the prevailing social hierarchy. Medieval canon law did recognise the concept of consent in marriage. In fact, a marriage was considered valid if both parties verbally consented, even without a priest present. Two people saying "I will" in a field somewhere could technically be married, a practice that was possibly romantic, but certainly legally confusing. This emphasis on consent was a significant development, representing a departure from earlier periods where parental or familial consent was overwhelmingly dominant. However, the contradiction of consent and obligation became apparent within marriage. While initial consent was vital for marriage validity, the marital debt doctrine effectively negated ongoing consent within the marriage, highlighting a significant legal and ethical double standard for women. Husbands had legal rights to their wives' bodies, and denying them could be grounds for complaint or annulment. Some church thinkers argued that spouses owed each other this marital debt, which was far less voluntary than a joint checking account. The explicit statement that the concept of marital rape did not exist in the Middle Ages reveals a legal framework where a wife's body was considered her husband's right, effectively overriding her personal autonomy within the marriage. This created a direct contradiction. Initial consent was paramount, but continuous consent within the marriage was not legally recognised, leading to potential coercion under the guise of marital obligation. Despite the theoretical acknowledgement of consent, its practical application was often limited, especially for women. For noble daughters, consent often came after marriage arrangements had been meticulously made by their families, who negotiated unions like peace treaties. The young lady's opinion might be politely requested or strongly implied, but ultimately the dowry often spoke louder than her voice. For peasant women, choices were broader, but still subject to significant pressure. Saying no to a match could mean economic ruin or social backlash, and refusing the local reeve's son was even riskier. This highlights that consent was often a formality within a system driven by economic and social necessity, rather than a reflection of individual desire. Still, the picture was not entirely grim. Medieval courts did prosecute cases of coercion and assault, particularly when witnesses were available or the accused did not possess powerful friends. Court records from urban centres like London or Paris show women and men bringing forward complaints, sometimes achieving justice, or at least creating a public outcry. Medieval literature, such as courtly love poetry, often danced around consent, with knights pining, ladies refusing, and everyone dramatically swooning, suggesting an awareness of the importance of asking, even if the answer was sometimes disregarded. This indicates that while the legal and social structures often constrained individual autonomy, there was a societal recognition of the concept of consent, even if it was imperfectly applied and understood through a different lens than today. The journey through medieval sexuality reveals a landscape far more complex and nuanced than popular imagination often portrays. It was not an era of unbridled wildness in the modern sense, nor was it uniformly repressed. Instead, it was a period defined by profound contradictions, a pervasive lack of privacy coexisting with ingenious methods of seeking intimacy, stringent church doctrines clashing with the pragmatic realities of human desire, and rigid social hierarchies influencing every aspect of courtship, marriage, and sexual expression. The absence of physical privacy for most people meant that intimacy was often a communal affair, forcing individuals to adapt and find covert moments within shared spaces. This constant proximity fostered a society where gossip and public opinion served as powerful mechanisms of social control, often more immediate and impactful than formal laws. Marriage, for the majority, was a practical contract driven by economic and social alliances, with love often developing as a fortunate consequence rather than a prerequisite. Yet, despite these constraints, human affection found ways to flourish, demonstrating the enduring human need for emotional connection. The Church exerted immense influence, attempting to regulate every facet of sexual life, from permissible positions to forbidden days. This maximalist approach, however, often met with quiet non-compliance from a populace more concerned with survival and the practicalities of daily life. The invasive nature of confessionals and the concept of marital debt highlight the Church's ambition to control private behavior. Yet even these systems face the inherent resistance of human nature. Myths like the chastity belt, though widely believed, are revealed as later fabrications, illustrating how subsequent eras projected their own anxieties onto the past. Real fidelity was enforced through social surveillance, shame, and the economic consequences of a tarnished reputation. The surprising reality of regulated brothels in urban centres further underscores the pragmatic approach of medieval society, where maintaining social order often took precedence over strict moral adherence. Personal hygiene, while different from modern standards, was not entirely absent, with daily ablutions and the use of scents to mask odours. The medieval understanding of senses as active transmitters of moral and spiritual qualities meant that intimate encounters were perceived as deeply permeable and symbolically charged. Attempts at family planning, though often ineffective and condemned by the Church, reveal a persistent desire for reproductive control, leading to desperate measures like herbal remedies and, in tragic cases, abortion or infanticide. Finally, the profound importance of female virginity as a social and economic commodity, coupled with invasive and unreliable verification methods, starkly contrasts with the male experience, highlighting the deeply ingrained gendered power dynamics of the era. Even same-sex affection, while officially condemned as unnatural, found expression in coded forms, revealing the messy realities of human desire beyond societal strictures. In essence, medieval sex was less wild, in the sense of uninhibited abandon, and more wild in its raw, unfiltered reality, a reality shaped by survival, faith, social order, and the enduring, adaptable nature of human connection and desire. It was a world where intimacy navigated unseen walls, whispered secrets, and the constant, watchful gaze of both God and neighbour. Thank you for spending this quiet moment with the Midnight Historian. If tonight's story helped you find calm, please consider subscribing to join us again under the stars. Leave a like or a gentle comment. It helps these peaceful tales reach others who need rest. Until next time, sleep well, dream deep, and let the echoes of the past lull you into peace.